Good evening. It is an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. My name is Joubin Eshaghian, and on behalf of myself and Iranian American Jewish Federation, I would like to welcome you to an informative session on voting for 2020 presidential election. My remarks do not represent anyone or any organization. They are my thoughts and my opinions only. More importantly, our discussions are not intended to endorse any of the candidates or political parties, nor to promote fundraising. My mission for creating this program was to educate everyone and encourage as many people to vote. Voting is an opportunity for our voices to be heard. At this point, I would like to give the platform to Mrs. Susan Azizzadeh, President of Iranian American Jewish Federation. Mrs. Azizzadeh has effectively united our diverse community through her leadership on topics of social justice, gender equality, and human rights. Her commendable hard work and dedication has enabled IAJF to establish strong relationships with many local and federal government officials within the State Department and Department of Foreign Affairs, allowing her to work closely with Envoy Elan Carr, Deputy Eli Kohanim, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to combat anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I ask Mrs. Susan Azizzadeh to continue from here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eshaghian. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Azizzadeh, President of the Iranian American Jewish Federation, a nonprofit organization which has served the community for the past 40 years. And I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar, as well as introduce our informative panelists. I would also like to give a very special thank you to Mr. Joubin Eshaghian for initiating and coordinating this important event, and additionally, thank our panelists for sharing their time and immense knowledge with us. We are very grateful to have you speaking with our community today. My friends, Iranians, like many others, come from a land where the voice of the people is disregarded. Our community was suppressed and ultimately forced to flee due to our inability to create political change as citizens. Here in the United States, we have the privilege of voting to make a difference and shape the future, a precious right that many of us have taken for granted since immigrating to the United States. But today, we hope to change this. This nation was built by prioritizing liberty, equality, and justice. Now is our chance to uphold these values. And Mrs. Lisa Daftari and Mr. Hans von Spakovsky are here to show us how. Mrs. Lisa Daftari, whom our community adores and loves, and she's the pride of our community, is an investigative journalist, Middle East and counterterrorism expert who has appeared on numerous outlets such as CNN, NBC, Fox News, PBS, NPR, and many more. She is the editor-in-chief of the multimedia news platform, The Foreign Desk, which I highly recommend all of you to subscribe to. This is where I get a lot of my news every day. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa has written exclusive reports for the Pentagon and has given a TED Talk on the topic of fake news. Lisa's areas of expertise include, but are not limited to, the Middle East and North Africa, terrorism, national security, cybersecurity, anti-Semitism, global Christian persecution, and human rights. Today, she will be speaking with Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, an authority on a wide range of issues, but most relative to our discussion today, Mr. von Spakovsky is the nation's foremost election law expert. He was appointed by President Trump to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity in 2017. He's the manager of the think tank's Election Law Reform Initiative, which examines not only how to protect the integrity of campaigns and elections, but to achieve greater fairness and security. A former litigator, in-house counsel, and senior corporate officer in the insurance industry, Mr. von Spakovsky worked on tort reform and civil justice issues for more than a decade, and has also been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. His analyses and commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, The Hill, and USA Today, and he appears regularly on Fox News Channel and on other national and regional news outlets. I will now gladly pass the webinar to Mrs. Daftari, as we are grateful and honored to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Susan Azizzadeh. You are the pride and joy of our community. My generation looks to you as the trailblazer for so many things, and I want to thank Joubin Eshaghian, as well. You've been emailed me from months ago, so enthusiastic about election law, about a fraudulent election, about mail-in ballots. I think he's ready to go collect all the ballots himself to make sure this thing goes right. So I hope that all of the concern that Joubin and many others have shown, all of those questions will be, or most of them will be answered. I know some of you wrote in, and I will try to get to those questions as well. Most of them overlapped, which tells me that the concerns that are on the minds of you and your neighbors are on the minds of most Americans for the upcoming election. So I will now turn to our esteemed guest, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky. I call him Hans because we go way back, and I have the honor and joy of having a very long-running relationship, professional and friendship with the lovely scholars at the Heritage Foundation. They are all superb minds, and as impressive as the bio was that Mrs. Azizzadeh read, it doesn't do it justice. So Hans, I'm going to turn to you to tell us a bit about why you focus your energies on the subjects that you do, and why this is so important right now.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm kind of the resident expert and analyst at the Heritage Foundation on elections and voting and campaign finance. And frankly, one of the reasons for it, and one of the reasons I'm honored to actually speak to your association today is, look, I'm a first generation American. My father was Russian. He escaped the communists. My mother was German. She grew up as a child in Nazi Germany. They met in a refugee camp in Europe in 1946 after the end of the war, and they immigrated to the United States in 1951. And I, as a child, grew up with stories from them and from my grandmother about what it was like living in a dictatorship, how important the right to vote was that we have in this country, and that it's up to the people to be ever vigilant to make sure that we maintain our democracy. And one of the most important parts of that is the ability to vote and the ability to have a secure, fair election with integrity. And so that's one of the reasons I got into this area and have worked on it now for close to 30 years.
Yeah. I want to pull up this amazing article that I came across that you wrote at the beginning of the month. And it's entitled, "Expect Chaos for the November Election." And you penned this piece. I found it to be fascinating. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you even decided to write such a piece?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I hope I'm wrong. about that. I hope I'm wrong and that we have a very smooth election. But look, here's the problem that everyone should understand and realize. Look, the vast majority of people in this country in every election vote in person. We do have the ability to vote by mail, by absentee ballots, and that's a necessity. There are people who can't make it to the polls because they're physically disabled or sick, or, for example, our military personnel serving overseas need to be able to vote by absentee ballot. But what everyone needs to understand is that if you have the ability to vote in person, you are much better off doing that than voting by mail. The reason for that is that the rejection rate for absentee ballots is much higher than if you vote in person. And what that means is that you may complete your absentee ballot, put it in the mail to mail back to election officials, and it will be rejected by election officials. The reasons are diverse. And if you want an example of this, just take a look at what happened in the state of New York recently. They had a primary on June 23rd. Because of COVID-19, they urged everyone to vote by absentee ballot. They had a huge increase in people voting by mail. As a result, 1 in 5 ballots were rejected. That means that 20% of the voters who voted by mail, their ballots didn't count. Now, why is that? Well, it was a mix of things. For example, those of you who vote by absentee ballot know that you have to sign the ballot, the envelope, when you send it in. Well, voters in New York, many of them forgot to sign the ballot, so their ballot gets rejected. When you fill out an absentee ballot and send it back, you have to provide a certain amount of information, your registered name, your address, other information that states require. In New York, individuals didn't supply all that information as they needed to. Also, you're depending on the U.S. Postal Service to deliver your ballot. Tell me, how many of you out there have gotten your neighbor's mail delivered to you, or have had mail delivered late, paying a bill perhaps, and it didn't get there in time? Well, in New York, again, thousands of voters, their ballots were rejected because their ballots were not delivered on time. Another problem they had, and again, this is a common feature of these kind of ballots, was the fact that the U.S. Postal Service forgot to postmark the ballots. And as a result, election officials received the ballots but didn't know whether they'd been mailed on time. And again, they were rejected. Those are just administrative issues. The other problem with absentee or mail-in ballots is they are more susceptible to being stolen, altered, forged, because they're the only kind of ballots that are voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. Plus, they make voters subject to coercion, pressure, and intimidation. Why is that? Remember, in every state, they have what are called anti-electioneering laws. That means that a candidate or a party activist cannot come into your polling place and push you to vote a particular way. In fact, in most states, they can't even come close to a polling place. Those laws don't apply to a voter's home, which gives them the ability to actually come knock on your door and try to pressure or push you to vote. The final problem I'll just mention very quickly is that in about half of the states, unfortunately, including even California, they have legalized what's called vote harvesting. Mm-hmm. What that means is, in every state, you can mail your absentee ballot back, or you or a member of your family can personally deliver the ballot down to the county election headquarters. But about half the states, including California, have made it legal for any stranger, any third party, to show up at your door and offer to deliver your ballot. Well, what does that mean? It means that individuals with a stake in the outcome of the election, candidates, campaign staffers, party activists, and political consultants have the ability to come to your door and offer to deliver your ballot. Well, what can you do to ensure that they actually deliver your ballot, or that they don't alter your ballot, or make other changes. If you doubt this is a problem, just take a quick look at the 2018 congressional elections. North Carolina, the 9th congressional district there, that race was overturned because of vote harvesting by a political consultant and his staffers who were going to people's homes, collecting the ballots and tampering with them before turning in to make sure that those votes were being cast for the candidate they were working for.
So for the individuals who, at this point, either they are forced to do a mail-in ballot,
right,
for many reasons, whether they are immunocompromised or live in an area where. I have several questions about this, and I just hope you can give us a broad, a kind of checklist. If they are registered to vote by mail, but have now, because of your wisdom, changed their minds, can they do so and go in and vote in person, A? And B, if they must do mail-in ballot, can you give them some pointers as to how to safeguard as best as possible that their vote is counted and it goes in properly?
Look, I'm not an expert on California law, but as I understand it, if you're on one of their permanent vote by mail lists, I think you can call or contact the local county election department and get off of the list, even if you receive an absentee ballot already in the mail. You can still go vote in person, and all you need to do when you walk in is take your absentee ballot that you got. I would take a magic marker and write void on it so it can't be used, hand it to the election official and say, I want to vote in person. And I think if you do that, you can, like I said, vote in person. Look, if you have to vote by absentee ballot, first of all, mail your ballot as soon as possible in order to make sure that it is not delivered late by the U.S. Postal Service. Again, to just give you a quick example of this, the goal of the U.S. Postal Service, according to its Inspector General, when it comes to election mail, absentee ballots, is to deliver those ballots on time 96% of the time. Not 100%, 96%. So that means they're expecting that 4% of the ballots, they won't be able to deliver them in time. That gives you an idea of the problem there. So I would mail it as soon as possible. Be very certain that you have signed the ballot and you have provided all of the information that the instructions tell you to provide, again, to ensure that it's not lost. And don't just put it, if you live in a single family home where you have a mailbox out front like I do, which anyone can open up, do not put your ballot there. Try to drop it in a U.S. postal box that can't be opened by strangers or passersby to get your ballot. Again, if you don't think that's a problem, the New York Post had a story just a couple of weeks ago. They interviewed a longtime political consultant who talked about how he's been stealing absentee ballots for years in New Jersey elections. And one of the things that they do is they collect absentee ballots completed ones, out of mailboxes, steam open the envelopes, and replace the absentee ballot that's been filled out by the voter with a new absentee ballot. And because they have the old ballot, they can easily forge the signature of the voter, send it in, and he said he's been doing this in multiple elections and he's never been caught. And that, again, shows the danger of this kind of thing. Do not give your ballot to a stranger who shows up at your front door and offers to deliver your ballot. Again, dangerous and a very bad idea.
I've had friends tell me that they have received multiple ballots to their name and address. What's all that all about?
Well, that is also one of the problems and one of the reasons that states that have made the decision to simply mail a ballot to everyone on the registered voter list, that's a very bad idea. And the reason is the states, they are not very good at maintaining the accuracy of their voter rolls. The voter rolls, particularly in California, are filled with individuals who should no longer be on there because they've died or they've moved away, or frankly, they've registered someplace they're not supposed to register. To give an example of that, I just published an article about the fact that a study of California voting records showed that there are 4 voters registered to vote at the NPR West headquarters in Culver City, California. Now, it is illegal to register at a commercial address. You have to register where you live, and yet there are 4 individuals who not only are registered at the NPR headquarters, but have voted from there. That's a serious violation of the law. Folks may have seen that in July, the Republican congressman from Kansas, Steve Watkins, was actually indicted 3 felony counts for registering at a UPS store, which is highly illegal, and casting a ballot in a municipal election. And there are people all over the country, unfortunately, who are registered more than once. And if they are, and the state sends out absentee ballots, they're going to get multiple ballots and they're going to be able to vote more than once.
Now, I wanted to ask you some general, voting law that might be specific to California, and I apologize ahead of time if they are. These are the questions that came in, or if they are, more on a national scale, and then we'll get specifically, to the questions that are regarding the 2020 election. Someone is registered as a Republican or Democrat, or and now wants to vote for the other party. How do they do so? Can they do so?
Well, you're talking about in the general election, they can vote for whomever they want to.
Right.
The registration process, when you register with a particular political party, the rules on that vary from state to state. There are many states where you don't register by party. Some states you do register by party. All that means usually is that if you've registered by party, in many states, that means that when you go in for a primary election, if you've registered as a Republican, they hand you a Republican ballot for the Republican primary. If you're registered as a Democrat, they hand you the Democratic ballot. But that rule doesn't apply to general elections. They're not supposed to even ask you or check on which party you're a member of when you walk into the polling place. All they're supposed to do is give you a ballot so you can vote.
Now, in California, in the 2016 general election, I remember hearing many anecdotes about the volunteers at the polling center inserting themselves, or even I heard a couple of accounts nearby about certain ballots being thrown into a different box. That kind of got people's curiosity peaking about what's going on. Now, if someone should see something that looks like foul play, what can they do?
They should immediately report it. They should complain to the manager of the polling place. And if that doesn't do any good, if the manager or somehow ignores it or is involved in it, what they should do is call the county election headquarters to complain to them and explain exactly what they saw going on. That's also one of the reasons why I would urge folks, look, if you have the ability and the time to actually volunteer to be a poll worker so that you're actually helping to run the polls on election day, please do that, because as an official election worker, you can try to make sure that everything is done according to the rules and there aren't any shenanigans going on. If you don't have time to do that, be a poll watcher. Candidates and political parties all have the right under state law to appoint poll watchers who can go into polling places and observe what's going on and report if they see anything again that is happening that shouldn't be happening. And again, I'd urge people to be poll watchers if they can. Though that is the key to transparency, and transparency is very important to fair elections. Just again, to give you a quick example of this, I don't know how many of you remember this, but in 2008 in Philadelphia, it was discovered that members of the new Black Panther Party in paramilitary uniforms with nightsticks were standing outside of a polling place in Philadelphia and and yelling racial epithets at certain voters who were walking into the polling place. The only reason we know about that is because there was a young college student who had volunteered to be a poll watcher. And he saw what was happening, actually took video of it with his camera outside the polling place and reported it. And if he hadn't have been there, that would have continued to go on.
Now let's turn to 2020, the presidential election. Obviously, I mean, this has been a crazy year, and that's an understatement of many sorts. And I don't have to go into it because we're all living it and experiencing it regardless of where we live in this country. Let's talk about 2020. What could specifically go wrong in this upcoming election?
Well, again, I hate to keep referring to New York, but that gives you a good example of what could happen. Again, New York had a primary on June 23rd. They encouraged many people to vote by mail. They had an exponential increase in absentee ballot. Election officials simply weren't prepared to handle this huge increase. It takes much longer to process, handle, and count an absentee ballot. As a result, it took New York, if you can believe this, 6 weeks to count the ballots from their primary. And remember, we have higher turnout in general elections than we do in primaries. After the 6 weeks it took them to count their ballots, they then had litigation contesting the outcome of the primary. Again, why? Because there was such a high rejection rate of the many absentee ballots that had been sent in by voters. And they had similar problems in New Jersey, in the town of Paterson. Paterson also went to an all-mail election. They've already ordered a new election there, and they've had 4 individuals criminally charged with absentee ballot fraud for apparently stealing and tampering absentee ballots. So take what happened in New York, high rejection rates, litigation contesting those high rejection rates, 6 weeks to count the ballots. And think about if that happens not just in one state, but in multiple states all across the country. It would make the Florida 2000 race look like a minor problem in comparison to having that kind of problem in many other states across the country.
And then what would happen?
Well, remember, when you go to vote in November, you are voting for a slate of electors. These are electors who have pledged to vote either for the Republican or the Democratic candidate, or in some states also the Libertarian candidate. The electors then have a meeting in every state in the first week in December. And that's where they are supposed to cast their votes for president, depending on which candidate won the majority of the vote in their state. But if there's litigation going on, or we have had problems counting the ballots, we could get to that first week in December, and there might be states where they still don't know which slate of electors is supposed to be having a vote, and the Electoral College votes for that state don't get counted. If the worst happens, and the worst would be if January 20th rolls around. January 20th is the end of a president's term. If on January 20th, we still don't know the outcome of the election, because there are still states that have not figured out who has won the state, and therefore we don't know who the president and the vice president are, there's a federal law that comes into place, it's never been used, which basically says that if the outcome of the presidential election has not been determined by January 20th, the acting president will become the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Speaker will remain the acting president until the outcome of the election has been determined.
Oh, wow. Do you foresee that happening?
I'm very hopeful that it doesn't. I'm hoping that whoever wins the presidential race does so with a substantial majority, so that we quickly know who has won and we don't get into this situation of having litigation filed all over the country contesting the result. I don't think that's good for America. I don't think it's good for the public. I don't care which party you're a member of or which candidate you represent. That is not the kind of situation we should want to have.
No, definitely not. The way that things have been going, I'm wondering if that's what we're looking at. I actually want to ask you, because you pointed out a lot of the logistical issues that may lead to the challenge of announcing a presidency. But how about the more malignant? How about a strategic attack? Can the election, specifically this coming election, could it be stolen? And how do you see, or what vulnerabilities do you see that would be? Because you pointed out a few different ways where fraud can happen. But in this particular election, how do you think, or what vulnerabilities exist that would lend itself to that happening?
Well, like I said, there are general problems with the high rejection rate of absentee ballots, the difficulty that I think election officials will have in processing, and the fact that those kind of ballots are more vulnerable to being stolen and to voters being coerced. The other big fear that people have had recently are some kind of cyber attacks on our election process. There was a recent briefing in Congress of the intelligence committees by intelligence agencies talking about not the Russians this time, but the Chinese potentially trying to do that. So far, there's been no evidence that there's ever been a successful cyber attack on our election process. That would be difficult to do for one particular reason, and that's something that actually is a product of the U.S. Constitution, which is the fact that, we have the most decentralized election system of any Western democracy. We don't have a central federal agency that runs our elections. Elections in this country are run by the states. Each state individually runs their own elections, and in fact, in every state, it's really run down at the county government level. So trying to engineer a cyber attack that could make a difference, I think, would be very difficult. There are a lot of precautions that have been put in place. The Department of Homeland Security actually, just a couple of years ago, set up a special cyber unit within DHS whose only purpose is to prevent any kind of successful cyber attacks on our election system. So at the moment, I think we're well protected from that, particularly because these days in most of the states, we vote through paper ballots, and you can't really launch a cyber attack on a paper ballot. You could try to do that into the computers that do the counting, but those are pretty well protected.
Looking at the map, what would you say are the states that will determine this upcoming election? And do you see, and what is their ballot system like? Is there any vulnerabilities there that we should be worried about?
Well, as you know, most people look to the battleground states, but look, because of our electoral college system, it's very hard to predict how the election will come out. In the last election, the 2016 election, you could see that most of the support for the Republican candidate was throughout basically throughout most of the country, with the exception of the big cities along the east and west coasts and the city of Chicago, for example. So there was a really huge geographic difference between the two candidates. Will that happen again? I don't know. Some of the key states are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and others. And what's going on right now in those states is fights over the absentee balloting process. I mean, to give you an example of this, Pennsylvania is a key state for the presidential race. And just last week, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court suddenly extended the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots. Now, there's been a lawsuit filed over that because, as all of you I'm sure know, it's up to the state legislature. They're the ones that have the legal authority to set the date, the deadline for an absentee ballot to be received by election officials. In this case, the folks arguing against us are saying, look, the state Supreme Court doesn't have any authority to do that. I don't know what's going to happen with that case. I don't know whether that decision is going to stand or not, but that could affect the outcome, because if you have huge amounts of ballots coming in late after election day, there's the possibility that those are ballots being collected and cast by people who waited to see what the preliminary results were on election day and then decided to vote after. And that's not the kind of system we want to have.
No. But you actually segued into what I wanted to get into next, which is the Electoral College versus the popular vote. So
Right.
After every election, especially the ones that are very close, across this country, they have the debate, how can the person who didn't get the most number of actual votes become the president? So why don't you give us your for and against? Electoral College, yes, no?
No, I think the Electoral College is a very valuable part of our democratic republic. And let me tell you why. And look, the number of times that a president's been elected who didn't win the national popular vote is just a small handful of the elections we've had. Look, here's what everybody needs to understand. The reasons that the framers of the Constitution put in Electoral College system are just as valid today as they were then. In fact, I think they're even more so. The framers were afraid that if a president was elected based simply on the national popular vote, then presidential candidates would basically only go to the big cities, the urban areas, to get votes, and they would ignore the rest of the country, particularly the smaller, less populated, more rural states. And yeah, the Electoral College system, the larger states still have more Electoral College votes because they have a larger population. But with the Electoral College system, even the smallest state with the smallest population still has a minimum of 3 Electoral College votes. So you can win a presidential race by convincing people across the country that you should be president. I think it would be a very bad idea to basically give the big cities complete control over the federal government. The other part of this is that, again, we don't have a national election in November, even though that's the way we refer to it. In fact, because of the Electoral College, the framers wanted someone running for president to win a series of regional elections all across the country. By doing that, by forcing candidates to do that, they hoped that you would get candidates who would try to appeal to a much broader cross-section of Americans. And it's important to understand that we are a very large, very diverse country in terms of everything from economic circumstances to geographic dispersion. And having a series of regional elections where candidates have to try to appeal to folks, not just in New York City and Los Angeles, but in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or Birmingham, Alabama, is, I think, a very good thing. And I think we should maintain the Electoral College. There's a lot of other good grounds for it, but that's probably the main reason.
But I'm going to play devil's advocate, Hans, and say by the
Sure.
same token, somebody who lives in a very, very blue state like California
Right.
might think that their vote doesn't count.
Well, they might have that feeling in the presidential race, but their vote does count. Remember, we don't just vote for president on election day.
Right.
There are numerous congressional races. There are state legislative races. There are city council, county commission, school board races. And every state, even states that are considered red states or blue states, when you start breaking down the counties and looking at the political persuasion of people in those counties, look, you find plenty of heavily red areas within blue states, and you find plenty of blue areas within red states, and your votes there are going to make a difference. Yeah, it's not entirely beneficial, but I think the benefits far outweigh the potential problems if you have an electoral college system.
You know, we just had an issue here in Beverly Hills where there was a massive scheme where they were ripping off the unemployment, services and getting unemployment cards. And it turned out that these individuals who were doing this were actually coming in from different states. And, you know, obviously, since we're so close to the election and, you know, these individuals were apprehended, but what's, you know, where will this end if they're doing this now? I mean, how we're so close to the election, how can we stop this from happening? And where are they getting their, these addresses from in different states? I know that with the protests, with the looting, we had a lot of people crossing over state lines in order to do that. You know, how can we watch out for this?
Well, one of the problems, unfortunately, that we have is that states don't do a good job, California not at all, of comparing their state voter registration lists with other states, for example, to find people who are illegally registering and voting in more than one state. And we know that that is happening. We maintain an election fraud database at the Heritage Foundation where I work. It contains proven cases of fraud. So these are cases where individuals have either been convicted in a court of law or a judge has ordered a new election or a state agency has. And unfortunately, we have cases in there of individuals who registered in more than one state and illegally voted in more than one state. And again, to just give you a quick example of this and how it could affect things is, look, in 2012, a woman ran for the Democratic, ran for Congress in Maryland. She won the Democratic primary, but she was then forced out of the race. Now, this is a woman who, if she'd won the general election, would have become a member of Congress. However, she was forced out of the race, even though she had become the Democratic candidate. Why? Well, because opposition research was done on her by someone in her own party. And they discovered that she was registered to vote in both Maryland and Florida. That's not illegal, but she had voted in multiple elections in both Maryland and Florida, which is highly illegal. She pled guilty to voter fraud. She was forced out. But the point of that story is that this was not discovered by election officials in Maryland or Florida.
Right.
It was only discovered because opposition research was done on her. I'm willing to bet you that if she had never run for Congress, she would have been able to continue to cheat and vote in multiple elections in different states, and she probably would not have gotten caught. And that's one of the problems with the system that we have right now.
Right. It seems like we can identify the vulnerabilities, but it's going to be much more challenging to stand in the way of this happening in the general election. Hans, I'm going to move to like a lightning round right now because I'm getting a lot of questions. People, I think, are enjoying.
I will try to keep my answers short.
Great. And if anyone has any more questions, please include them here. I will try to go down the list as fast as possible. Some of them are repetitive, so I will. There's a question about the ballots, that the in-person ballots being provisional. They're not the same as the regular ballots.
Right. In 2002, Congress passed a law called the Help America Vote Act. And one of the provisions they put in, which applies to all elections now, is they put in a provisional balloting process. And what that means is you can't be turned away from a polling place just because your name might not be on the voter registration list. Under that federal law, if you show up at your polling place and they say, oops, you're not shown here as a registered voter. If you say to the election official, hey, I'm an eligible voter and I registered to vote, they have to provide you a provisional ballot. You vote the ballot, they put it in an envelope, and then they separately give you a form to fill out in which you provide them with information on where you register to vote, when you register to vote, et cetera. And what happens is those ballots are kept separate from the regular ballots. And after Election Day, election officials are obligated to investigate the circumstances. And if they find, in fact, for example, that they made an administrative error, they accidentally dropped you from the voter rolls, you really are a registered voter, they have to count your ballot. So that's the purpose of provisional ballots. It's to catch mistakes that have been made by election officials and ensure that nobody loses their right to vote.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. How soon can people start voting in person?
Well, that depends on the state. About 2/3 of the states now have early voting provisions that allow you to, they open up a small number of polling places prior to Election Day when they have a much larger number open, and you can go and you vote early. But again, it depends on the state. And some states, early voting only starts about a week before election. Other states, it starts as much as a month before the election. So you're just going to have to check where you live to see, one, do they have early voting, and where are the early voting sites located?
Okay, wonderful. We had an interesting question. They said, is it safer if they have a mail-in ballot to go drop it off actually at the polling location, or to trust USPS to take it?
No, if you have the ability to drop it off at the polling location, or prior to Election Day down at the county headquarters building, I would urge you to do that. Look, let me ask everybody a quick question. If you won the Powerball lottery, would you be willing to put your ticket in an envelope and hand it over to the U.S. Postal Service to deliver to the lottery agency? I think everybody would say, absolutely not. Well, yeah, your ballot might not be as valuable as the Powerball lottery, but the same principle applies.
I had a question earlier on and I kind of skipped over it, but I wanted to ask you about the USPS controversy and everything, going on with that. And do you think, how do you think that's going to play out in the election? Will there be any effects?
Well, actually, if folks are interested in that, I actually have an article today in the Daily Signal, which is the electronic newspaper of the Heritage Foundation, specifically about this issue. And this idea that the Trump administration and or the new Postmaster General have somehow deliberately done things in order to slow the mail is just absurd. There's no evidence of that. And it's particularly a dumb claim because it's not just Democrats who vote by mail, it's lots of Republicans too. So they have no incentive to do that. You know what one of the big complaints was about the reforms that the new Postmaster General was trying to put in? A rule that postal carrier trucks had to leave on time from postal facilities to go deliver the mail because they were having a problem with many postal carriers leaving late. And yet that supposedly was some kind of secret cabal to slow down the mail. So I think some of the claims we made are pretty silly, but there's no question the U.S. Postal Service has all kinds of problems. They've had problems for many years when it comes to delivering the mail and delivering it on time.
So you don't think it's something that's, more, there's nothing more to it than either laziness or incompetence or just the speed at which snail mail goes these days? Do you think they actually, might see a Trump sign or Biden sign on your lawn and then do what they will with your ballot?
Look, I don't know about that. I do know that we recently added look, I think most of it is not intentional in terms of politically intentional. It's just that, look, the U.S. Postal Service needs a lot of reforms. Those reforms haven't occurred. They need somebody to come in, and frankly, it suffers from bad management and old-fashioned processes. It does not resemble the kind of efficient operation, frankly, that private carriers have, like Federal Express or UPS, all of which are run much better than the U.S. Postal Service.
There's a lot of, I think these are state-based. What's the last day to register to vote? Do you need to register more than, if you've already registered, do you need to register every year? Just specific questions about being registered?
Yeah, the registration deadline again varies from state to state. So you just need to check with that. You could easily do that by either calling or checking the website of the county election department wherever you live. Different states have different rules about how you don't have to register every year. But at some point, if you don't vote in several elections, they'll send you a notice saying, do you still live there? And if they do, you need to send it back and say, yeah, I do still live here. Because at some point, if you don't, they may take you off the rolls because they may think that you have moved.
Wonderful. Well, I guess my last question, and I'd be remiss not to ask you, is if you were a betting man, and I don't know if you are one, who do you have your bets on for the 2020 presidential election, Hans?
I don't have a bet on the election, and given how surprised everyone was at the 2016 election, including the pollsters, I wouldn't even start to try to predict who's going to win the race this year, particularly because we're in a situation I've never seen before, which is states all over the country are basically at the last moment changing the rules on how people are going to vote and how they're going to administer the election. So I just have no idea.
Yeah, and you know what, just to follow up on that, you mentioned a handful of lawsuits or potential lawsuits. I mean, how quickly can those be effective if these things go wrong during the election? I mean, will they have any effect?
Well, remember in 2000, we had the election beginning in November. It was in December before the Supreme Court issued a final decision that allowed us to figure out who had won the presidential race. So if we have litigation, it could be weeks, it could be a month, it could be 2 months before we have a determination on if the outcome is in doubt. So again, I think it's just very unpredictable at this point.
Well, thank you so much. You're a powerhouse of information. This was extremely informative. And I thank you for your time. And I want to pass it back to Joubin Eshaghian for some final words.
Thank you. I would like to thank our guests, Dr. Spakovsky and Lisa Daftari, for all their time and efforts to prepare for this presentation and taking the time tonight. You did an amazing job. Be sure to exercise your power of voting. Do not be a silent majority because every vote adds up. Please be prepared to vote and vote in person to make sure your vote is counted and encourage your friends and family to vote. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. There will be another Zoom coming up soon regarding the propositions, which IAJF will be sending out the emails soon. Thank you very much and good evening.